Good morning, KVEC region. I wanted to come to you guys in the midst of this pandemic and talk to you guys, as you see on the screen, talking about journals as primary sources. But before I do that, I really wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that many of us are seeing the hard work that you are engaging in, that you have changed direction, not in midstream, way past midstream, and you've done that with tremendous finesse, and you have just been incredible. You have met this demand on a level that, had I still been in the classroom, I don't know that I would have adapted so quickly. And I just really want to take a moment to say thank you. There are some tremendous things happening out there. You guys are sharing things and connecting with each other on a level that I don't think that people anticipated would happen. So, and I apologize for moving my hair twice, not once, but twice. So let's go into this a little bit together. This is just a conversation that I want us to get started talking about journals as primary sources. There are a couple of articles that are going around on Twitter and on Facebook. And one of those is from a teacher that teaches middle school. I'm going to have the link to that article in just a moment. Her name is Laura, and she talks about seeing her students again after she had not seen them for a couple of weeks. And so she was standing there as people were going in to get their stuff for whatever it was, however she introduces that whole idea. And she talks about the things that the kids said to her and how that prompted her to think about how she could connect with them in journaling and how they could participate in this historical moment. So that being said, so let's really kind of start thinking about that, because I think that at this moment, we all have to realize that we are no longer just observers of history, that we are no longer just, that history doesn't happen to us, but that at this moment that we are part of history, that we are witnessing history. And not only history, because we see that every day, whether it's in the newspapers, but at this moment, we're really, I think we're witnessing a seminal moment in history. And you know, what measures that for me is looking at it deeply and saying, how are we going to be different when this is over? And if we say, just a little different, then that's not one of those big turning points or one of those seminal moments. But when we look at this and say, well, almost every system has been disrupted and we may never do this one thing the same ever again, and that applies on multiple levels to multiple things, then we have to realize that this is a turning point in history. And I think at this moment that we are seeing that as we come out of this COVID-19 pandemic, that we are going to be very, very different people. And if that's the case, then we have to start changing how we think about how we approach things in our classroom, in our community, in government, whatever it may be. So with that in mind, let's talk about our role as social studies teachers in this to help our students record these changes, because now they are going to be the recorders of history. So thinking in terms of recording, you guys see I have a couple of visuals up here from the Penn State University website. You can actually Google this and you'll find some of these images and you'll find their website. I highly recommend that you guys do that. But when we think about it now, how can we help our students journal? And the beauty of this is because there's going to be multiple entry levels depending on their literacy ability and understanding. For instance, we'll have students that are in the upper elementary, middle, and high school grades that may have different entry levels, as I mentioned a moment ago, in terms of their literacy ability. The reading and writing may not be very easy for them, but their thinking definitely is always going to be there, and it is always going to be on grade point. So we still have to give them that ability to express themselves just as we do every student. In other words, we've got to differentiate for every student and give them points that they can come in on and communicate their own thinking and learning. So that being said, so let's talk about this on every level, K through 12. So when we think of Flipgrid, TikTok, Seesaw, we really think, well, especially Seesaw is going to be a K2 tool. Highly recommend that. I've had several teachers come to me and say, this is phenomenal for the lower grades. When we think in terms of Flipgrid and TikTok, we tend to think about 4th, 5th grade and up, that they are very, very comfortable with that media. When we think about middle and high school, we start thinking a little bit deeper into vlogs and blogs, visual podcast. I never would imagine, and I have started doing this myself, said, watching a video where I sit around and just watch other people talk. And it's much more than a talk show. And I got to say I have really enjoyed that, but also podcast, because I can listen to those in my car or whatever it may be, but also photo essays. And as, and the students can either take the pictures And again, I know that sometimes teachers are kind of like, well, wait a minute, there's got to be, and of course there is, because that student's going to submit these things to you, that you're going to have the opportunity to vet those. But there's opportunities for photo essays that either the student or the family takes pictures of, or that the student collects and brings together from different media sources, maybe from newspapers perhaps that, their parents are bringing in or that's delivered to their home, or magazines that they're purchasing or whatever it may be. We can find different ways for students to communicate their thinking and understanding. But on the next level, when we see directed student entries, we have the opportunity for free writes and responding to quotes or headlines and responding to art or pictures. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a moment with the New York Times, because they have some direction in much of that. But I think the beauty of this, and as a historian, I like to call myself, but I'm a social studies teacher that really loves history. I think that when I look at this, what I'm excited about is the idea that literacy is no longer, or literacy level is no longer going to be an issue. So many times in history, there are voices that are completely eliminated because they did not know how to read or write. There are times in history that we have only 2 or 3 perspectives, and we know what those perspectives are, and there's so many voices that are missing. But now we have the opportunity, because we have so many different forms and different formats, that students can bring their voice in, that we have, and their families. I think that we cannot in this moment, ignore their families as well. Their families have to be part of this learning, because all of us are experiencing this historic moment. So when we think about the idea that no voice is going to be eliminated, I get really excited, because that is the very thing that we as social studies teachers, when we talk about the different disciplines, that we're always looking for all of those voices. And so this is an opportunity for us to make sure that those voices are heard, even from our region. This is so incredibly important. So as we think about that, and I hope I just hit something on the thing, so I hope everything's okay with that. You guys kind of see that I've made sure that I've made some very specific notes, because I want to make sure that you guys can come in, watch this quickly, do a little bit of research. And then what I would love to do later on next week is sponsor a Zoom meeting where we bring teachers together from different grade levels. So you'll be getting an email about this later. So please think about joining us on that, so that we can get together and just basically have a collaboration between teachers, where we come in and say, this is how I'm thinking about doing it. I am creating a Google Doc that teachers will be able to go into and to share their prompts, and maybe to borrow someone else's prompts. So you guys will see that I will send that drive out, and it's going to be empty initially, but my goal, my hope, is that all of us can start sharing within that. So this is the article I mentioned to you guys earlier. This is a link that will be in there. And again, this is going to be a link that's going to be attached to the comments. I really recommend that you guys go in there and look at it. I think this idea, thank God for the Benjamin Franklins. Thank God for James Madison, because he actually takes the time to not only keep a journal, but he also keeps detailed notes of the Constitutional Convention. We have very specific, and for the most part, I'm sure there has to have been some stuff left out, but intimate details of the Founding Fathers' discussions around the issues and policies they were creating regarding our nation's founding. So, we have that information, and because of him. And we think about, the Thomas Jeffersons. Okay, to give you another example, let's think about, Edison and his inventions, and most importantly, his patents. So, all of this becomes part of history. Well, now very much our students' journals are going to become part of history. So let's talk a little bit about how we can use those, and especially to connect to our content. So in this case, what you guys will notice, I have focused on K-5 initially. I think that's 6th through 12th grade, and I'll do a quick talk through on that. I think that I think those are going to be probably easiest to plug that in many respects, especially once you hear how, we're going to discuss the K-5 progression in terms of connecting to the to the content through the Kentucky Academic Standards for Social Studies, our new social studies standards. So when we look at this, so for instance, in kindergarten, because the focus is on community, okay? Because it's me and my community. So again, are they going to journal every day for kindergarten? And most importantly, keep in mind, the TikTok, the Seesaw, the Flipgrid. They could do vlogs to a degree, but the Flipgrid might be good because you can only do up to 2 minutes. So when you start thinking about how you want those kindergartners to talk, give them those prompts to say, what does your community look like now? How are people moving around your community? When you look out your front door or you look out your front window, what do you see? What do you notice? When your family talks together, what are those things that they are talking about? You guys know how to ask those questions to get them to those talking points or those thinking points for that grade level. I am middle and high. So, but you guys are the experts with that. So how can you get your kids really sensitive about noticing what's happening within their community? That also really includes their family. I mean, it can be as simple as you can start telling those kids to save those receipts for when they go grocery shopping. I know this sounds crazy, but when you look about when you start thinking about the supplies that we need, when we go back and we look at history, when we go back to plantations and we are looking at the history of enslaved people or whatever it may be, or how plantations operated, we very much go back to tax forms, or we go back to their extensive logs that were maintained about what was purchased and how much. Well, at this moment, those grocery receipts are going to tell you a little bit about your family. What are you eating? What are you buying to maintain yourselves? Are you buying for the long haul? Are you buying for things? Are you buying less fresh stuff because you don't want to go to the grocery store as often? There's all kinds of things that you can talk about there. When we look at first grade, because it's myself, my community, and my state, those even though I know for first grade, those 5 o'clock conversations with our governor, Andy Bashir, may be difficult sometimes because he may have to talk about things that first graders may not understand, or it may make them a little, fearful. Maybe perhaps you can show some of the graphics that he shows and talk to the students about that and then ask them what they're thinking. But again, because they're looking at their community, they can start looking at things. For instance, you can start sending them small articles that talk about these businesses have now been shut down. How is that going to impact your family? And I know that this is incredibly sad, and this is why we cannot ignore the social emotional learning potential in this moment as well. We might ask these kids sometimes, how has this pandemic affected, let's hope it's not infected, their family in terms of economic conditions? For instance, are their parents staying at home now with them? And again, because you are the professional with that grade level, you know how you can talk about that with them. Or you can find ways, maybe perhaps, that you could do a class-wide journal for that day. You can do what they call a word cloud, and I know you guys do that all the time. You can do a little poll with the kids and get them to submit words for that one day at the end of that week or whatever it may be. And depending on how you write that prompt, and those kids send those words, and you can create a word cloud with it that you share with them the next week, because you can see those words that appear more frequently. I think having the opportunity for them to also really look at the actions that our government is taking statewide to protect the citizens, I think is something that first graders are ready to start kind of being aware of, because it will make them good citizens in the long run. And that's one of those words that we've got to make sure, one of those tier 3 words that we've got to make sure that we're using. And he's using those words, and he's also using the hashtag Team Kentucky. So you can talk about the importance of hashtag Team Kentucky. What does that mean? I bet you've got a lot of students that are going to be very aware of that. When you think in terms of second grade, because now it goes to North America, those students can start looking at actions taken by the federal government, actions taken by the different governments, because second grade deals with Canada, United States, and Mexico. What are each of those countries doing to protect their citizens from COVID-19? How is the relationship between our 3 countries changing because of COVID-19? There's all kinds of impacts there. So you can kind of start thinking in terms of that. Fourth grade, restricting movement and migration. That's a biggie. So again, with each of these, and mind you, the only thing I did to get this stuff that you guys see up here today is I've gone into the introduction for our new standards and looked at the focus. So when you go into that opening paragraph, as I've told you guys numerous times in the different webcasts and in the standards trainings I did this summer and fall, go back to those opening paragraphs, look at those, and really dissect them and say, and think deeply into that and say, okay, how does this focus play into what's happening around us right now? And you can think of how to design those, and that's why, again, I say that it's going to be really important that we have this Zoom meeting, that we can get together and talk about these things out loud. And I really want us to do that. Fifth grade, the roles of the branches. We're seeing lots of action take place between, at least two of the branches right now. So we can talk about that. What are those laws that are being created? What are orders that are being, and again, you can always go back to state government here as well, because there is the Kentucky strand that we've got to make sure that we're always addressing. So think in terms of how that focus, when you go into the opening paragraph and then go down into the standards. And you can see, for instance, in fifth grade, when they look at the interaction between branches, there you go. You've got some potential journal entries that you can do there. And that's going to be really important to see a student's perspective on that. You guys will notice over here on the example. And when we talk about the maps, especially when you look at third grade, by the way, because that is global. As this one third grade teacher tells me, well, I went from, teaching social studies mostly from a state perspective, and now I'm teaching the whole world. So when we look at the whole world in terms of this pandemic, that is big. So just to kind of get started, one of those activities that you can do with those students, and these resources are out there. And for those of you that work with third grade, please contact me, because I have these resources coming in from a couple of sources. I've contacted them, so they're going to be sending those in. So I'm also going to publish those within that Google Doc that I'm talking about. But when you think about, and then also, I believe the C3 Teachers has produced some inquiries around COVID-19. So that's going to be another link that I add to the within the comments. So when we think about it, let's try to find maps that are showing the progression and the movement of this virus worldwide. For instance, where did it start? And talking to the kids about, where it started. Where did it go next? Why did it go there next? Why didn't it go someplace else? What are those factors that, that allowed the virus to be transmitted so quickly to those areas? As you talk about this, how do the communities respond to the virus? For instance, once it is discovered in the Wuhan province, how did the Wuhan province react, most importantly? And then what was the role of the media in that reaction? Then you move on, and here it says, how do they limit migration and movement? How do they limit travel? How has it impacted trade, not only within China and Asia, but then how has it impacted trade around the rest of the world? And then when you talk about how the virus has impacted relationships, not only between countries, but in communities, how does it impact the way that we worship? How does it impact the way that we communicate now? So there's all kinds of ways to look at this, because we we're not only citizens of our state and our country, but we are global citizens. So there are resources that are out there. And again, I really recommend that you guys go look at the c3teachers.org. And there's going to be some potential, I think there are some inquiries there that you guys can look at. So I think we have to think about, especially as we look at this, I think something that's incredibly important for us to realize is that in these moments, and this is why now our standards are K12, is that we are creating. Now, not every student will be a historian or an economist, geographer, political scientist, but there are going to be students there who are going to respond on a really heightened level to some of these prompts and some of these activities that you're going to do. Some of these sources that you're going to be looking at. You are going to be changing who they are as a student. You're going to be changing who they are as a person by exposing them to these sources. And by doing that, you may be opening them up to a world that they would have never known that existed before. And when you also do that, you're offering them the opportunity to express themselves. Because for some students, I know that I always loved history, but there were only certain years I really encountered it, at a higher level, throughout my education. And I would get so pumped when I would get in that teacher's class, and I'd be like, yeah, I'm ready to go. Well, you guys know that some of those kids, they're going to be right there with you. And again, like I said a moment ago, that's going to change who they are. So I think that's, when it comes to social studies, there's just something about that for me that just gets me, well, you can see, it gets me really excited. I mean, it's so important for us to have the Edisons and the Einsteins of the world. But you know what? We need our, as I mentioned earlier, Benjamin Franklin, we need our Lincolns and our Rousseaus, and they are developed. They start in moments like this. So let's give them that ground to, define themselves in or on, and to grow from there. So that being said, let's go on. And now let's talk about this social, emotional aspect. I think one thing we could think about doing, and again, I think this needs to be very tempered. I think that we are talking about an incredibly stressful time for families. And in that respect, let's try to give our families, along with their student, the opportunity to express themselves in this. It also gives you a tremendous opportunity to connect with parents and guardians, to really kind of talk with them and let them see what you're doing and bringing them into it. I think with these new social studies standards, I think that there can be nothing that is more important than that. So when we think about it, we can almost create a family time capsule. Again, let's temper that. I don't want us to make light of this, but I think that if you really frame that thinking, and again, this is why it's so important that we collaborate together in this, frame the thinking in a very serious way, but something that your family, and that time capsule is not something that they're necessarily going to put together and put it in a metal box and bury it in the yard. It's not like that. It can be a scrapbook. It can be a journal that you do together as a family, or just like a small folder that it's understood that when you guys bring everything together, all of you sit down, you look at it, you process it together, you make comments together. These students are going to be so creative in how they want to do that. They could even do an iMovie showing these things and putting those words in there, or putting in clips of different family members that are talking. These kids will be so creative in how they bring that information together and share that information. But the biggest thing is for us to give them the opportunity to share in that moment together and to express there have been some positives. We're always going to look for a silver lining. Families are spending more time together, but at the same time, there are stresses that are going to be involved with the fact that the parents are not working. That's why they're at home and that kind of thing. So we have to honor those moments. We have to recognize where they are and come to them in that moment. But then also at the same time, as we are maintaining connection with our students and with our content, bring the parents in and give everyone that avenue, give everyone that area and that safe space to express themselves and to record this moment together as a family. So how cool would it be? And I've got this up here, let's help the student be the family historian. Who knows, maybe in this moment, because these students are learning to do this, they're going to keep doing it after. How many times have you guys sat around as a family and you said, oh man, I wish I had granddad telling the story of how he was, part of the invasion of Normandy on D-Day. Or how many times I wish grandma had sat down and told us how she makes apple butter. And we had recorded that and had saved that. Or how many times that you talked about, Uncle Joe and his great stories, but how he told stories from the 1920s and the 1930s about your community. And you heard stories even about your state or about the country that was going on. For me, my favorite stories with my grandparents was always hearing about how they grew up on farms. They grew up very, very rural. And my grandmother talks about how difficult it was for her to go to college and what a real trial it was for her family. But that story told me the story of perseverance. So I think that there are stories that we have like that in our families, and now we need to tell them because they weren't told before. So this is even an opportunity for us to tell our stories as Kentuckians and as people from Eastern Kentucky, or people growing up in Appalachia. This is that time, and who knows, we may keep it forever. So how cool would that be? So on this next slide, I wanted to show you guys, this is a link to an article. As you guys see, this was a lesson of the day done by the New York Times. You could go into New York Times, register for free. As I also think mentioned earlier, that they actually have just a COVID-19 section where they sometimes give daily prompts for journal entries and that kind of thing. This whole idea of journaling this is really getting a foothold within our communities and our schools. So think about this. But this one was a really interesting lesson. And as you see, there are photos from a century of epidemics. And it starts with the flu of 1918. I think that one thing that it is remarkable for me, and I'm going to tell this story, and this, by the way, is no judgment on any textbook writers or textbook companies. I want to emphasize that. But, I sat down and started thinking about, as a U.S. history teacher, and a world history teacher for high school, I tried to think of how many times I really taught the 1918 epidemic, and I thought of a few times. The flu epidemic that happens after World War I, or toward the end of World War I, and then 1919 it makes it to the United States and that kind of thing. And there's a documentary that's done by PBS that's really good about this if you guys want to go back and look that up and watch that later. But anyway, I'm very embarrassed to say I probably never taught it enough, especially considering that many of those students I taught are now living through a pandemic. So I went back to one of the textbooks, and I'm not going to name the textbook or anything, but one of the textbooks that I used, and I pulled it out, and there was one sentence, one, in the entire book about the 1918 epidemic. And I think that I think that's one reason why what we are doing with our students now is going to be incredibly important. So considering how it has disrupted every system, I think we need to talk about it a lot more. And I think now finally we're going to go back and we're probably going to look at other pandemics in a very different way, in a very different light. So as I mentioned on this last slide here, creating historians in this moment, we have to give students the opportunity to express their thoughts, their concerns, and within those concerns, there are many questions that no doubt our students will have and their wonderings, because we have to give them the opportunity to create meaning around an event, because when they develop that meaning, they create an understanding and an attachment to that event. And after all, we as social studies teachers, ultimately, we are much more than tour guides through history. You know, we have a real responsibility to instruct our students in how to record history, and most importantly, how to process it responsibly and intentionally, because now we understand the value of bringing in every voice and every perspective, and especially in times like these. With that in mind today, I would like to thank you for joining me for my own wonderings in this moment. I want to encourage everyone to look at the links that are going to be within the comments section of this webcast. Thank you for joining us.